They came from Lydia. That was Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, trying to explain the Etruscans to a Greek-speaking world that found them baffling. 2,500 years later, that single sentence was still the most popular answer to the most stubborn question in European prehistory. For 2.5 millennia, every schoolbook carried some version of the same story. The Etruscans were foreigners. They had sailed in from the east, from Anatolia, from a kingdom Herodotus called Lydia. Strange neighbours, strange tongue, strange visitors from across the sea. And in 2021, an ancient DNA study quietly broke it. What the genomes recovered from 12 Etruscan cemeteries showed was something nobody on either side of the old debate had predicted. The Etruscans had not come from Lydia. They had not simply been there forever either. They were a third thing, something the historians had missed, hiding in plain sight for 2,500 years. To get there, we have to walk into a painted tomb in Tarquinia and read a genome that was buried 26 centuries ago. We have to follow the numbers in a paper almost nobody outside ancient genetics noticed when it came out. And above all, we have to climb into the hills above Florence, where the answer to a 2,500-year-old question is still walking around. It begins with two ancient historians who never agreed on anything. One of them was about to be very wrong. For most of recorded history, there were two answers to where the Etruscans came from. Herodotus said east. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing 4 centuries later in Rome, said no. They had been here all along. And for 2.5 millennia, no one could prove either side. The Etruscans built cities across central Italy, taught the Romans how to read entrails and lay out streets, and then vanished into the empire that owed them everything. What they left behind was an alphabet, painted tombs full of dancing figures, and a language no one could place. That was the part that kept the debate alive. Latin, the language of Rome, was Indo-European, so were Oscan and Umbrian and Greek. Every neighbour the Etruscans had spoke a language descended from a single ancestral tongue carried into Europe during the Bronze Age. Etruscan was not. It was a language of its own family, isolated, with no cousins anywhere in Europe, and in a world where languages travel with people, that suggested the people had travelled too, from somewhere outside. Herodotus had given them an origin, Lydia, in what is now western Turkey. He told a story about famine and a king named Attis, whose son Tyrannus led half the population across the sea to find a new home. The Greeks called those new arrivals Tyrrhenians, the Romans called them Etrusci. Same people, two names. Dionysius hated the story. He pointed to the strangeness of the Etruscan language compared to anything Anatolian, the customs that did not line up with Lydian ones, the absence of any memory of migration in Etruscan ritual itself. He concluded they were autochthonous, native, always there. For 2,500 years, classicists picked sides. The Anatolian theory had Herodotus and a gut feeling that strange languages must come from elsewhere. The autochthonous theory had Dionysius and the absence of any clear migration signal in the archaeology. Both sides had good arguments. Neither side had evidence that could close the case. The debate moved from the libraries of Alexandria to the universities of 19th century Germany to the genetics labs of the early 2000s, and at every stop, the answer changed depending on who was holding the data. To understand what finally settled it and what happened to the Etruscans after the answer was found, you have to look at a study almost nobody outside ancient genetics paid attention to when it came out. If you find yourself wanting to know how a question this old gets answered, this is the kind of evidence this channel exists to follow. Subscribe. There is another one coming. The paper came out in September of 2021. It was published in Science Advances by a team led by Cosimo Post at the Max Planck Institute. The title was technical, dry, something about an archaeogenomic time transect. Nobody wrote a press release that captured what it actually did. What it did was this. The team sequenced the genomes of 82 individuals from 12 archaeological sites across central Italy. Tarquinia, Vetulonia, Volterra, Chiusi, the cemeteries of the Etruscan world. And not just one moment, the samples spanned 2,000 years, from 800 years before Christ, all the way to the year 1000 of the Common Era. That meant they were not just looking at Etruscans, they were looking at what happened to the Etruscans, before, during, and after Rome. The Iron Age individuals, the people we call Etruscans, were genetically homogeneous. They formed one tight cluster, and that cluster was made of 3 layers. The deepest layer was Western European hunter-gatherer, the ghost ancestry that runs underneath most Europeans. Above that, the much larger contribution from Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the people who brought wheat and barley and pottery into Europe roughly 7,000 years ago. And on top of those 2 layers sat something more recent, steppe ancestry, Yamnaya, the herders who came west out of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia during the Bronze Age. About a quarter of every Etruscan genome traced back to those herders. Their Y chromosomes told the story even louder. 3 out of every 4 Etruscan men carried R1b, the haplogroup the steppe migrants brought into Western Europe. What the genomes did not contain was a recent signal from Anatolia. There was no Iron Age migration from Lydia, no genetic trace of refugees arriving from the eastern Mediterranean a few centuries before Herodotus wrote his sentence. The DNA of the Etruscans looked, at the level of population structure, indistinguishable from the DNA of their Latin-speaking neighbours. Same 3 layers, same proportions, same people, genetically. Herodotus had been wrong. The Etruscans had not come from anywhere. They had emerged, locally, from the Villanovan Bronze Age cultures that preceded them in the same hills, the same valleys, the same coastlines, which left one question untouched, the one that had kept the debate alive in the first place. Stop for a moment and picture what that means. If you could walk into a Tarquinian tomb in 700 before Christ, you would not be looking at the descendants of Lydian sailors. You would be looking at the same Bronze Age population that gave Rome its farmers and its soldiers, speaking, for reasons no one had been able to explain, a completely different language. If the Etruscans were genetically just like everyone around them, why did they speak a tongue that belonged to no family in Europe? The answer turns out to be older than the debate. Etruscan was not a language someone brought in, it was a language someone kept. Before the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age, Europe spoke a patchwork of pre-Indo-European tongues, scattered from the Atlantic to the Aegean. Most were erased when the Yamnaya descendants moved west, replacing not just genes but speech. Indo-European languages flooded the continent, but not everywhere. In a few corners, the older tongue survived. The Basques of the Pyrenees are the most famous example. Their language has no living relatives. Their genomes show the same Yamnaya ancestry as everyone around them, but the original speech of pre-Bronze Age Iberia stayed. The Etruscans were doing the same thing. Their genomes had been overwritten by the same Bronze Age admixture that overwrote the rest of Europe. Their language had not. They had absorbed the new arrivals, taken on their R1b chromosomes, drunk their wine and copied their bronze work, and kept speaking the language their grandmothers had taught them. The paradox dissolves once you see it. Genes and languages do not always travel together. Sometimes the people change and the words do not. The Etruscans were, in that sense, a fragment of an older Europe, one that everywhere else had quietly forgotten, and then Rome happened. The origin question was settled, the survival question was not. The same paper that traced the Etruscans back to the Bronze Age also tracked something stranger. What happened to those people once Rome decided they belonged to it? The answer is not absorption. By the imperial period, between the years 100 and 500 of the Common Era, the population of central Italy had shifted again. Hard, about half of the local ancestry had been replaced by people from the eastern Mediterranean, Greeks, Levantines, Syrians, North Africans. Italy became a genetic crossroads, and the old Etruscan profile was diluted into something cosmopolitan and unfamiliar. Whatever was Etruscan in the population had been overwritten. From a distance it looked that way. Then the empire fell, and another wave came in. Lombards, from northern Europe, swept south and added another 10 to 40% of northern European ancestry into the central Italian gene pool. By the year 1000, the population of Tuscany looked nothing like the Etruscans of 700 before Christ. Almost. In the hills above Florence, the older signal had refused to dissolve. The mitochondrial DNA of Volterra and Casentino, isolated communities tucked into hard country, still carries lineages traceable to the Iron Age. They are not the urban Florentines. They are the people who never left the high valleys when the empire and its aftermath swept the cities below. In the broader Tuscan population, the older ancestry is diluted but not erased. Modern Italian studies place Tuscans closer to northern Italian and Central European gene pools than to southern ones, and somewhere inside that signal, the people Herodotus tried to explain are still there. Still walking the same hills. Still descended from the population that decided 2,500 years ago to keep speaking their own language no matter who arrived. The debate had lasted 2,500 years because both sides had been asking the wrong question. The right question was never, where did the Etruscans come from? It was, what happened in the gap between their language and their genes? Herodotus had heard a good story. He had passed it on in good faith. He had been wrong about the direction of travel, but he had been right about something he could not have known. The Etruscans really were different, not because they came from somewhere else, because they were the last people in central Italy still speaking the language of an older world. The Lydians, in the end, had nothing to do with it. The mystery had been at home the whole time. If you want to keep following this, the DNA evidence the history books left out, every week, one piece at a time. Subscribe. Every week there is another piece of the record that turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than the version we were taught.